Escalation, the dictionary definition goes, means to become greater, more serious. I've done both of those things in my life, but still wouldn't expect Vladimir Putin to fire a nuclear missile at me. Many in the West, though, are so fearful of this possible Russian response to any so-called escalation in the war in Ukraine that they won't allow certain donated weapon systems to be used further inside Russia than just a teeny-weeny bit along the border. Faced with the unending prospect of having to fight this war in a pair of golden handcuffs, Kyiv has decided to test the limits of Moscow's so-called red lines by doing two things: invading Russia and developing its own fleet of ballistic missiles.
Випробування позитивно першої балістичної української ракети. І я з цим вітаю наш оборонно-промисловий комплекс.
It's the diplomatic equivalent of President Zelensky thumbing his nose to bullies and timid policymakers alike and saying, escalation, smescalation.
Момент в цьому плані – це примус.
All these things were planned with two ideas in mind. First, to break the political logjam of very little happening in Washington before November's election and equally little happening in Moscow, where Putin still harbours aspirations to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign state. And the second aim was to test quite how firm Moscow's so-called red lines are. Back in November 2021, when Russia was laughing off any ridiculous ideas about an imminent invasion of Ukraine, Putin outlined a few scenarios in which a Russian nuclear response would be considered. He didn't explicitly state this, of course, but the hints were clear. These scenarios included Ukraine's membership of NATO, Western troops inside the country, or any direct threat to the sanctity of the Russian motherland. He appeared to single out long-range ballistic missiles. If some kind of strike systems appear on the territory of Ukraine, he said, the flight time to Moscow will be 7 to 10 minutes. Just imagine. What are we to do in such a scenario? He asked. We will have to then create something similar in relation to those who threaten us in that way, and we can do that now. Since then, though, one red line after another has been erased from existence, as if they were written in invisible ink. In April 2022, 2 months after the three-day invasion began, Russia sent a diplomatic note warning of unpredictable consequences should the US and NATO continue sending weapons to Ukraine. This was just after President Biden approved an $800 million package, including 155mm howitzers. 2 months later, Putin threatened to strike targets we haven't been hitting if the West gave Ukraine MLRS, including HIMARS, the multiple launch rocket system. In December that year, after the US pledged Patriot missile systems, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the suffering of the Ukrainian people will continue longer, and a few short weeks later, as Germany debated giving the green light to free the leopards, Putin's spokesman issued dire threats of nuclear retaliation, echoing Dmitry Medvedev's words once he'd put his glass down, that nuclear war could be triggered should Russia lose the war. There was then a period of relative calm. Until August, when a former Russian general called for a nuclear strike on Ukraine because of the counter-offensive. And, bringing us up to date, in May 2024, after then Foreign Secretary David Cameron backed British weapons being used to strike into Russia, Moscow threatened to target British military sites directly. Threats all very predictable and all utterly hollow. But, in terms of nuclear diplomacy, Putin is a largely rational actor. Sure, he allows talk of a good nuclear Armageddon from loyal automatons like tired and emotional Medvedev and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Tap your chin, Sergei. It boosts circulation and gets rid of the dangly bits. But Putin himself is in no rush to commit suicide by NATO. He's clearly dusted off the old Soviet ideas around information operations and psychological warfare, a collection of theories started in the 1960s, better known as reflexive control. Study your enemy, break down their biases, understand the stimuli to which your adversary will have an automatic Pavlovian response, and then feed them exactly those incentives. The Kremlin knows what policymakers in the West are rightly afraid of. So they ensure scenarios of nuclear Armageddon are put out in the public domain with such regularity it becomes impossible to judge what is a bluff and what is a genuine concern. Putin has invested in information operations. He's pushed the narrative that says the war is in stalemate, that Russia has infinite resources of men and material, and that Kyiv cannot outlast Moscow. When he feels the heat, he reaches for the reflective control handbook and feeds us another doom-laden prophecy of nuclear incineration. So will Ukraine's recent actions on the battlefield and development of its own ballistic and drone capabilities break the cycle of reflexive control and free Western policymakers from the tyranny of the Emperor's new red lines? And is it too late? In terms of targets, the low-hanging fruit for any new ballistic missiles has gone. ATACMS and Storm Shadow would have been of much more use if deployed years ago. But Russian forces supporting the Kyiv front and any eventual action to retake Kursk will provide a target-rich environment. The Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank, has very helpfully just produced an interactive map of such Russian military sites in case any Ukrainian targeteers are watching. Any such action, even hundreds of miles into Russia, will be tactical in nature, not a strategic threat to Putin, and therefore nowhere near even his own imaginary nuclear red line. There's no point shouting at Washington about escalation and stamping your nuclear feet if it's domestically produced Ukrainian ballistic missiles raining down on your military bases. It would have been better if the first Russia had known about a domestically produced ballistic missile had been when things started to go bang.
Деталі про цю ракету більше не можу поділитися, але тим не менш.
By announcing it so publicly, it suggests President Zelensky is frustrated at the red line charades, and there is perhaps a hint of desperation from Ukraine to get the limits shifted. But if the shock, to everyone except Ukraine, of Kyiv's advance into Russia has shown anything, it's that policy positions around the conduct of this war and fears of escalation, hitherto thought immovable and ruinously consequential, may not be quite as fixed as they once appeared. After all, lines in the sand, red or otherwise, are always washed away with the next tide. Defence in Depth is a regular video output by the Telegraph of the big defence stories. If you'd like a daily fix of content about the war in Ukraine, I'd suggest Ukraine the Latest, the Telegraph's podcast. For more defence stories, we've left links in the description below, and if you have a topic you would like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Please do visit our website for the latest updates, news and analysis, or failing that, you could buy the paper.